Good evening. Thank you for tuning in to Lessons of Vietnam show. Here we strive to tell the real stories of the Vietnam War and the men and women who were involved in the show. Not all of them are in Vietnam, but there was a lot of people back stateside working very hard for the people in Vietnam and their families and so forth. It's important to us to dispel the myths, mistruths, misunderstandings of the war and its participants. There's a lot of bad information out there. I am Bill Dixon, Vietnam veteran, 1967, 1968, Tet survivor, and your host for the show tonight. We broadcast from the Raleigh, North Carolina studios of Nissan Communications, and you should check out some of his other shows. We were just sitting here watching one of them before we came on the air. You are welcome and encouraged to participate with your host during the show. Call in. You can see there on the screen the 919-518-9773, or even better, go on to Skype and go to Computers 2K Voice. And if you have a comment, question, suggestion, or think what I'm saying is not holding a whole lot of water, please let us know. That's what we're here, trying to get the right information out. And even though we do a lot of research, this doesn't necessarily mean that we got it researched the right way. So if you out there, give us a shout out and tell us whether you like the show or whatever. And if you don't like the show, give us a shout out, but just don't tell anybody else. Tonight, our show is about two men, Ripley and Rescorla, men with moral courage. And heroes are ordinary people who make themselves extraordinary by a gentleman by the name of Gerald Way, who I do not know who he is, but it sounded good what he had to say there. And courage is being scared to death and saddling up anyway. And for you younger folks out there, you may not have, it's hard to believe that somebody doesn't know who John Wayne is, but he was, back in our day, he was the hero of all of us. He made, a couple of hundred different movies. He starred in all kinds of war movies and Western movies and bigger than life. And he was everybody's hero. And sometimes you have a guy standing up shooting at people and not behind something. We say he was out there, John Wayne in it, and so forth. So this is this picture of the two men we're going to be doing the show about. This is the story of the two men who showed great physical and moral courage. You're not going to hardly believe the things these men did while they were in Vietnam, and one of them after Vietnam. Other men could have said, I have already done more than we ask of me. This is too much, and just walked away, and they wouldn't have thought less of them. In other words, when the episode we're talking about in the show tonight happens, they had already done so much. They could have just said it's impossible. Because looking at it, it is impossible. But what they did it anyway. They didn't know it was impossible. And they could have walked away and nobody would say anything about them. Not only courage in Vietnam War, but here in the United States, they showed a lot of courage. So that's the two men. Integrity is moral courage in action. So let's just say that these two men had a lot of integrity. Now, going back to 1972, Nixon and the Vietnamization. When Richard Nixon was elected president in 1969, his main concern was withdrawal of American troops and getting North Vietnam to the peace table at any cost. Now, I have stuck an extra table in there for somewhere. I do that just to test y'all, see if y'all paying attention. North Vietnam communism main concern was taking over of South Vietnam. Nixon thing was to get us out of Vietnam, no matter what it takes or who we hoodwinked in the process. Vietnamization was a gradual pull out of U.S. troops. Nixon ordered massive bombings of Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam during the peace talks. The last big project assigned to U.S. Navy Seabees, that's the Seabees are the builders, kind of like the Corps of Engineers with Army. During their 1969 deployment to Dong Ha, was to build a bridge over the Bodin River, or Bodu River, excuse me. The new bridge would open a main artery on Highway 1, allowing supplies to freely reach troops in the DMZ. The DMZ, which was the demilitarized zone between the two countries, North Vietnam and South Vietnam, and it was kind of a no man's land out there. And Dong Ha was right on the edge of that. Dong Ho, I went to Hawaii. Dong Ha was the northernmost town in South Vietnam and was the location of a strategically baked, imported U.S. Marine Corps combat base. Okay, I was thinking about Dong Ho's tiny bubbles there. This is the area we're talking about. You see the big line there. It says Dong Ha Bridge. And then you down here in the left-hand corner, you see Khe Sanh Combat Base. And you see off to the left there, Laos, the country bordering where the Ho Chi Minh Trail went down, and the DMZ, you see there. And then Highway 1 goes from Saigon right on up into Hanoi. But one of the things I wanted to point out to you, see Dong Ha there, Quang Tri, Camp Carroll. Camp Carroll is going to be very important in our first story. Quang Tri area was the most bombed area in the history of warfare at the time. So that kind of gives you an idea a little bit of when we talk about different towns and so forth in Vietnam, that you kind of get a feel for just where we are and what we're talking about. This is about as far north as you can go in South Vietnam and still be in South Vietnam when you get to that military zone. Okay. This is the bridge at Dong Ha. 5 concrete piers, their tops hidden beneath the water, was used as stepping stones by the steel and wood giant that lurched across 530 feet of space. This had to be one of the largest built CB bridges in Vietnam. Once completed, it was one of the largest highway bridges in northern I Corps. And I think it was probably one of the largest ones built by the CBs anywhere. But there's the bridge. You can see how awesome it is there just outside of Dong Ha. Beginning in 1969, U.S. Army and Marine combat divisions began leaving Vietnam with Vietnamization. By 1970, both Marine divisions had departed, and by 1972, American in-country strength had fallen from a peak of 550,000 to some 75,000. That's 75,000 scattered all over South Vietnam. Most of them were in the advisory position. The only U.S. Army ground combat units left in Vietnam were the 196th Light Infantry Brigade and the 3rd Brigade of the 1st Cav Division, Air Mobile. U.S. Air Force and naval units had been withdrawn down as well, going back to Vietnamization. The Communists had tried a few low-key excursions to test American resolve. In other words, they would come across into South Vietnam and attack a small base or a village or whatever, and then step back and see what we did. And since it was Vietnamization and they wanted the Vietnamese to take over, American politics said, no, we can't go back in there. So nothing happened. So they got to thinking, well, if they didn't come and get us for doing that, we can go more. So they kept escalating. All that remained was for the NVA to administer the coup de grace. In other words, there was nothing, the Americans weren't going to stop them. By the spring of 1972, the North Vietnamese Army, the NVA, had completed its buildup and was ready to mount a large-scale attack on South Vietnam. Now, this little attack was a little bit different than Tet because this battle was basically a army battle or a military battle of troops facing troops, where Tet was a lot of guerrillas sneaking in and so forth. But this was a totally different. The NVA were well trained. They had some instances better equipment than we have. Okay? And that's what Operation Win Way was designed to do, better known as the Easter Offensive. It dropped all pretense of guerrilla war. Instead, it was a 3-pronged, multi-divisional NVA cross-border invasion, well supported by tanks and heavy artillery supplied by the Soviet Union and Red China. See, we weren't just fighting North Vietnamese and the guerrillas. We were fighting, we were fighting Soviet Union, Red China, Cuba, and a couple other communist countries at the time. This new operation was much bigger than 1968 Tet Offensive. It was bigger because it was a mass military just marching right on down like World War II and so forth. There's a book, and there's many books out there talking about the Easter Offensive. The cover of that one says The Last American Advisors. There were very few advisors left in Vietnam. Colonel Turley was one of them. And so, as part of the assault, 2 infantry divisions, 30,000 soldiers, that's North Vietnamese soldiers, with tanks and artillery support, began to cross the boundary between the two countries and attack south along Highway 1. Remember that on the map, the main north-south artery. 30,000 North Vietnamese, well-trained, well-equipped soldiers. They would first have to seize a highway bridge over the main water obstacle, the Qua Viet River. Now, that's my own pronunciation. Just north of the town of Dong Ha. Been back 3 times, and we always go to Dong Ha. It's the pits, as far as I'm concerned today, and probably the pits then too. Only the 3rd South Vietnamese Marine Battalion was in a position to block their critical avenue attack and buy some valuable time. Okay. This is the North Vietnamese Army. You see, they had uniforms and so forth. And we talked about the Marines a while ago. 700 South Vietnamese Marines. The battalion was entrusted the awesome task of stopping at least or hindering 30,000 North Vietnamese with 200 tanks and some air assets. 700 men are going to hold off 30,000 well-trained men with 200 tanks and aircraft and all this other stuff. The small number of remaining Americans now in ground combat were assigned to South Vietnamese units as advisors. So there weren't that many, and they were spread out. Okay. Few men were better qualified to provide assistance in this nearly impossible assignment than Marine Captain John Ripley of Radford, Virginia. A graduate of the Naval Academy at Annapolis, he led a rifle company through a year of intense combat in 1967. Ripley came back, and Ripley then served an exchange tour with the British Royal Marines. Okay. After doing this thing with the British Marines, returning to the United States forces, he graduated from both the Army's Airborne and Ranger schools, and also trained with the Navy's frogmen and underwater demolition teams. On his second tour, when he came back, Captain John Ripley was an American advisor in the northern regions of South Vietnam in 1972. He was at Camp Carroll, and you can see where Camp Carroll is in relation to Dong Ha and Khe Sanh, a fire base between Khe Sanh and Dong Ha, advising South Vietnamese troops. Things were mostly quiet when he got there, but then they won't no more. Okay. Camp Carroll, as you can see a picture of Camp Carroll. It's hard to believe that was overrun, but you get the idea. There was a lot of North Vietnamese coming in. Camp Carroll was overrun, and its ARVNs, that's the Army Republic of Vietnam, that's South Vietnam, garrison surrendered. Ripley and another American escaped on a CH-47 Chinook. Chinook is one of the big helicopters. But even it's limited in what it can carry. The helicopter took on too many fleeing ARVN troops and was forced to crash land on Highway 1 near Dong Ha. They had so many people on there, it was hard to keep it going, and rather than land it kind of crashed. At Dong Ha, close to the DMZ, which we've already talked about, that separated North and South Vietnam, he found he being Ripley, a number of South Vietnam Marines who had no intention of surrendering. He also found some 200 North Vietnamese tanks and self-propelled artillery backed up for 6 miles. In other words, as he looked out at the bridge, they were backed up 6 miles trying to get across that bridge. And they were ready to cross the Cam Lo River. Okay. Now, this gentleman is the Vietnamese Marine. He was a major. The picture there has him as a lieutenant colonel, so the picture must have been later. Having trained in 4 elite units, Ripley had now joined one of the finest units in the Vietnamese Marine Corps, itself an elite division. Major Lee Ba Bien commanded the 3rd Battalion and had a record every bit as impressive as an American advisor. This man was tough. Major Lee Ba Bien, commander of the Vietnamese 3rd Marine Battalion, wounded at least a dozen times. He had already been decorated for valor on 7 separate occasions when the 1972 Easter Offensive started. Ben was always out front where the action was the heaviest. He was revered by his men and would endure any burden to defeat the hated communist. Remember his 700 men? I was wrong. It's 735. Major Ben promise proved impossible to keep. But the 735 men of the 3rd Marine Battalion held Dong Ha for 4 days until they too were completely surrounded and were forced to make a fighting withdrawal. Now, remember, backed up 6 miles, 30,000 North Vietnamese well-trained army, 200 tanks, and mechanized artillery, and they stood out for 4 days. That's in itself is hard to believe, but okay. With the world crumbling around his Marines and generally poor showing by most ARVN units in Military Region 1, as you remember, the Army had already surrendered, Ben intended to follow the orders he received, which was hold at all costs. That was the orders he was given. Early on, an erroneous report was broadcast that Dong Ha had fallen. Major Ben broadcast on his command radio network that were Vietnamese Marines in Dong Ha. We will fight in Dong Ha. We will die in Dong Ha. We will not leave. As long as one Marine draws a breath, Dong Ha will belong to us. He won't plan on running away. His men won't run away. There's the bridge again. The Vietnamese Marine 3rd Battalion was composed of 4 rifle companies. 2 of them and Captain Ripley spent the night before Easter Sunday at an abandoned combat base just west of Dong Ha. As the day dawned with overcast sky, Captain Ripley went on and examined the shell craters. The artillery fire was being directed away from Camp Dong Ha. The camp. It was going in towards Dong Ha. They were bombing Dong Ha. He called his radio man to give a report to his own headquarters. Headquarters relayed the orders. Fall back on Dong Ha and defend the bridge. I'll give you more information when I can. That's kind of the cryptic message that he was given. Go to Dong Ha and hold the bridge. Okay. On Easter Sunday in 1972, at 10:15 in the morning, Captain Ripley radioed his headquarters that he could see 200 communist tanks headed his way towards the bridge. Ripley was finally given the order to somehow blow the bridge. Up until that time, they'd been wanting to save the bridge because they wanted to save the bridge so that they could go back, the South Vietnamese could go back across the bridge to fight. But then they realized that there was no way 700 Marines were going to hold that bridge indefinitely. The Dong Ha Bridge, as you can see it there, was high in Hanoi's plans for the new offensive that was launching to take over South Vietnam. The NVA, North Vietnamese Army, needed the Dong Ha Bridge to bring their tanks and tracked vehicles into South Vietnam. South Vietnam also wanted the bridge to get their troops over. That's why there was so much back and forth, blow the bridge, don't blow the bridge, blow the bridge, don't blow the bridge, hold the bridge. As Ripley's group approached Dong Ha, they saw the result, the destructive firepower of the enemy's heavy artillery. Corpses lay dismembered and forgotten along the roadside. Dead livestock and overturned cars were strewn in all directions. Then the artillery started again, countless guns firing together and shells exploding all over Dong Ha, but only the town, not around the bridge. It was being blasted off the map. Everything came to a halt along the highway. You can see people there trying to escape. 100 yards from the south end of the bridge, Ripley and another American and Ripley's Vietnamese radio operator prepared to go along to the bridge. The Marines were holding off the communists from coming across. So Ripley and 2 other guys, one was an American who was actually a major, even though they don't mention it here, and his radio operator headed to the bridge with orders to blow it. Studying the bridge through his binoculars, Captain Ripley saw that the bridge was built simply but massively. The bridge's basic strength lay in steel I-beam girders that held up the superstructure. They ran longitudinally, that is, in the direction the traffic would flow. Each girder stood 3 feet high. That's a 3-foot high steel beam, okay? And the flanges extend 3 to 4 inches on either side of the vertical member. There were 6 of them across with about 3 feet between them. With all that steel, Ripley thought up to himself, the Seabees could have built a battleship. There's a picture of the bridge. You can see there. That's how it was built. You can see those steel beams. These 100-foot long girders sat on top of massive steel reinforced concrete piers, intermediate supports that rose 20 or 30 feet out of the river. At both sides of the river, the 100-foot spans connected with abutments and end supports. Now, here's a man that's given a job to blow this massive bridge up. As you can see, it wasn't a little wooden bridge. It was a massive bridge. That was a bridge built to stay. Ripley surveyed the scene directly in front of him. Along the river, along the near river bank, 2 companies of Major Ben's South Vietnamese Marines were dug in. Across the river on the north side, there had to be thousands of NVA troops investing the area. Halfway down his slope sat a bunker built up with sandbags, set up with sandbags, little left over from a previous battle. You can see a bunker with the sandbags right there at the edge of the ridge of the river. However, to get there, okay, we'll skip that part for a minute. That's where we are. Ripley, another American officer, broke from cover and ran straight for the bridge. Fire increased as they neared their objective. You remember, 30,000 on the other side and 2 men trying to go to the bridge. A lot of people didn't want them to go there. A heavy tank machine gun kicked a spray of dirt in front of them. Ripley drove himself harder and harder. When he safely reached a bridge abutment, he was almost collapsed from the exertion of getting there. He wondered how much longer he would have to keep going. The explosive was waiting for them. About a dozen pine boxes and an equal number of canvas haversacks. Ripley read the stencil on the 3-foot boxes. Demolition TNT. Each box contained 150 blocks that looked like the gray industrial soap. The haversacks contained plastic explosives to be used in conjunction with the TNT. I believe that was about 180 pounds of explosive there that he had to get up on the bridge. He began to inch himself along the beam. His legs took a beating. The razor wire sliced numerous cuts in his legs, which bled profusely. As you can see there, there was a fence and then the bridge with the razor wire there. Through the wire he went. He was sweating heavily. The sweat rolled into his cuts and they began to burn. At last, he was through the wire. Okay. This is I think this is an artist's drawing of him there swinging from the bridge. With 90 feet to go, Ripley left his feet, dropped free, and proceeded by hand walking down the girders. In other words, he had to hold on to those girders and go hand by hand down those girders. Arriving at the pier, he made an attempt to catapult himself into space between the outboard girder and the next one upstream. In other words, those big piers there, having to blow those was going to make the bridge. And all while he's doing this trapeze act there, all those people on the other side are going, oh, he makes a nice target, and shooting at him. His legs would not cooperate. His energy was gone, hanging only from his hands that began to ache. Either he flipped up between the 2 beams soon or he would fall into the river. Once again, he almost made it that time. On the 3rd try, the heels caught on the flanges. Remember, this thing's 3 feet high. Then he twisted around until his body was spread eagle between the 2 beams. One leg on one side and the other leg on the other side with a 3-foot span. He set 2 haversacks of satchel charges and crawled up on his elbows and knees back to the other American, which was Major Smock, and the fence. The Major passed the first 2 boxes of TNT and 2 more haversacks through the razor wire, which cut the Major's hands and arms. Spread eagle between the 2 girders, Ripley placed the boxes on the flanges and dragged the loads, which weighed more than 180 pounds, back to the pier, where he set the charges to the first box of explosives. Okay. Once more, he dropped down, hold on to the bottom flanges with his hands, swinging back and forth, building momentum, leap, grab, catch the heels, and then muscle into a channel between the next 2 girders. In other words, you had the pier, concrete pier, then he had to go get and walk down till he got to the where he could go back up between the next girders at the pier. When his legs and lower body fell below the beams, the communist rifleman fired into the steel girders with rounds ricocheting all over. Nothing hit him once up into the channel, he was safer. Not safe, but he was a lot safer up in there. For the next 2 hours, Ripley worked his way back and forth, setting the charges. When he finished, he crawled back through the razor wire, got through that wire again, dropped to the ground, and lay there for a while, grasping for breath. Yet he only accomplished the first part of the heroic undertaking. The exhausted Marine had to go out there again and set the detonators. Ripley would have preferred to use electronic blasting caps and wire, but none were to be found. Only old-fashioned percussion caps and primer cord. To make things more difficult, he could not find any crimpers. That's the crimpers there where you crimp that percussion cap onto the wire. Okay. Ripley had to crimp the caps onto the cord with his teeth. Since the shiny cylinders would explode if gripped too hard in the wrong place, a slight miscalculation would blow his skull apart. He remembered that back in Ranger School, an instructor had placed a detonator inside a softball and set it off. The explosion blew the cover, stuffings, and strings all over the place. Now, how would you like to be having to bite that thing down going, how hard do I bite? Carefully, he placed the caps into his mouth, open end out, and put the primer cord into the open end. He slowly bit down. It worked. The second time would be easier, but he had to fight off the overconfidence. To remember the softball. Now the Marine captain was ready to go back out again. And I imagine every time he bit down on that blasting cap, he remembered that softball. Okay. This time the enemy was waiting for him. The communists immediately opened fire, far heavier than before, with hundreds of rounds bouncing off the girders. Over and over he prayed to our Lord Jesus Christ and his blessed mother, Jesus and Mary, get me there. Jesus and Mary, get me there. As he reached the upstream box of TNT, a tank shell hit the girder about 2 feet away. Now, you know that shook and gave him a shake. The angle was too flat and it bounced off and exploded on the south bank with a violent crash. The vibrations almost knocked him into the river. He set the detonator into the plastic explosive and lit the other end of the cord with a match. At least he had a match. He had measured enough cord to allow about 30 minutes, give or take. Ripley worked his way over to the downstream side and repeated the process, and then hand walked back to the fence. That's hand walking over and over like a trapeze. He realized that he had exceeded all normal human endurance. So again, turned to God and his mother. Jesus and Mary, get me there. Jesus and Mary, get me there. That's what kept him going. He climbed back through the razor wire once more and fell to the ground near the abutment in a bloody heap. He was so tired he could hardly lift his arms. For nearly 3 hours, Ripley had dangled onto the Dong Ha Bridge, rigging it to blow, and frustrating the enemy trying to kill him. 3 hours he'd been on that trapeze between the thing. However, the major tapped him on the back. Look what I found. But you don't need them now. He poured into a box of electrical detonators. Ripley looked at the caps and realized he had to go through the ordeal again on the bridge once again. That took integrity, because I'd have said, heck with it, but not necessarily in those words. He had always been taught to rig up a backup charge if one was available. At this point, the substance of the man takes over. He had to be going on just his integrity and just plain old guts, because he was exhausted. His moral integrity triumphs. In fact, through the entire ordeal, it was the guiding principle, so he returned again simply because to do the right job demanded it. So now he's got to go back through the razor wire and hand walk on back again. Okay? The South Vietnamese Marines unleashed a barrage of fire to cover them, yelling encouragement as they went by. Da Nguyen Di, Da Nguyen Dien. Captain Crazy, Captain Crazy. In other words, you're going back again, you got to be crazy. That's what the Vietnamese Marines were saying to him. Returning to the bunker, Ripley looked around for a way to trigger the explosive since they had no blasting box. So he went out there and hooked up these electrical things, but electrical things don't work good without electricity. Nearby was a burned out truck, but the battery appeared to be in good condition. Ripley tried several combinations to set off the explosive. Nothing worked. The terrible thought of failure came over him. At that work, and the bridge was still intact for the use of the communist forces. After all that he had done, I mean, just sheer will got him through it, and gets back and nothing happened. Can you imagine the frustration that man had? The captain would have to warn headquarters to give time to others to regroup from farther south. He would stay with the 3rd Marine Battalion. Major Ben would never pull back. The battle-scarred warrior would die at his post with no forethought of death. From across the river, Ripley heard the tanks starting up. The massive assault by the communists was ready to begin. In other words, the tank and all sit there waiting to see what he was going to be able to do, and nothing happened. So, then the bridge blew. The shock waves came before the noise. The noise arrived, growing louder and louder, and series explosions became one huge roar. The entire 100-foot span dropped into the river, leaving a huge gap in the bridge. The time fuses had done their job. What he did first, when he lit the fuses with the match, they had finally done their job, not the blasting caps. So that biting down on him. This is a diorama of the Ripley Bridge at the Bancroft Hall at the United States Naval Academy. Diorama there showing him hanging from the bridge and so forth. So I thought that was nice to put there. Now, the battle continued to rage around Dong Ha for days after, but the overwhelmed forces of the NVA soon began to wear on the defenders. Remember, 753 Marines were holding everybody off. A large group of communists were pressing down on Dong Ha from the west. Ben's Marines were still dug in and holding. Ripley was making desperate calls for artillery support when a barrage of mortar fire from the communists wrecked the area, singing all-out attack. But see, Ripley could not get mortar fire or barrage of any kind, because if you remember last show, we talked about the rescue of Lieutenant Colonel Ezekiel Hamilton, Bat 21. There was a no-fire zone, and which covered about 17 miles, and Ripley and his bridge here was only about 5 or 6 miles from where the colonel was trying to be rescued. So even though there was 30,000 troops, 200 tanks, they couldn't fire back at them with artillery, or the ships on the shore couldn't fire back because there was so many airplanes flying around and helicopters trying to get Hamilton rescued. You wonder how things would have turned out different if Hamilton hadn't been shot down. At that moment, a vehicle, now some crazy things happened in Vietnam. At that moment, a vehicle carrying 7 journalists and cameramen raced up, completely oblivious to what was going on. They jumped out and surrounded Captain Ripley with microphones, asking one silly question after the other, which is what they normally do anyhow. Okay. Ripley yelled to them, "Get out of here. The NV are attacking." A mortar round exploded, throwing all of them into a pile on the ground. Ripley crawled out from underneath the bodies. Some were dead, others lay groaning and bleeding. I think they got their story. A few days later, the 3rd Marine Battalion received orders to break through the encircling enemy. In a few weeks after that, it was pulled out of action. In other words, they were surrounded by then. Of the original 700 Vietnamese Marines, 52 survived. People always talk about the ARVN guys sometimes breaking and running or leaving you there. 700 Vietnamese Marines did what they said they were going to do. They stayed there until they lost 648 men. That's good leadership, I guess, and also strong will with them. The ARVN regrouped and held a defensive line 10 miles south of Dong Ha. Thus, the eastern offensive was stopped because the NVA failed to cross the Dong Ha Bridge. Dong Ha was basically, as a town, was destroyed. When the peace talks came about, they were, Dong Ha was actually belonged to the North Vietnamese. There is no sports analogy for what Ripley did. What Ripley did was simple, impossible. Had he failed with it while attempting to do it, his peers would have only thought his noble and brave for trying. The significance of the timely destruction of the bridge at Dong Ha cannot be overstated, both in terms of Ripley's personal heroism and the impact it had on the entire communist defense. Now, this is the movie, Ride to Thunder. I'm gonna highly encourage you out there to get this movie. It is kind of the continuing story of Ripley and Major Ben after the war. It tells about how the major went to re-education camps and how Ripley came back to the United States and some things he went through. And then when Ben got out of the re-education camps, it talks about him and his family involved there. Ripley gets him back to the United States. And it is a fantastic movie. It's not long, but I think you thoroughly enjoyed it. It's really a follow-up on the show we just did. John Ripley, a former enlisted Marine, stayed in the service until 1992 when he retired as a colonel after 35 years of service. That's him, Colonel John Ripley. He served 2 tours in Nam, taught history at the Naval Academy, trained naval officers at the Virginia Military Institute, and earned 2 Legion of Merit awards. Okay. Now we're going to talk about another hero here. This man you see there, as picture, that is a picture of him on the book, We Were Soldiers Once and Young, which the movie was made of. We Were Soldiers that Mel Gibson and starred in. Lieutenant General Hal Moore, as a colonel, he commanded the 7th Cavalry at the Idrang Valley. If you remember anything about history, there's a guy by the name of George Armstrong Custer, also commanded the 7th Cavalry at the Little Bighorn, or he got a couple arrows stuck in his back. Rick Rescorla is, according to Colonel Hal Moore, is the best combat platoon leader I ever saw. He was awarded medals, including the Silver Star, and a picture of him in action forms the cover of We Were Soldiers Once and Young, a book which was later turned into the 2002 Mel Gibson film We Were Soldiers. And they're trying to look up the information about him. The movie kept popping up. This is him. Cyril Richard Rick Rescorla was born in Hull, Cornwall, England. Served in the British Army. He later served in the military intelligence in Cyprus, jobs with the Metropolitan Police and Northern Rhodesian Police in what is now Zambia, followed before he immigrated to the United States and joined the United States Army to help fight communism in Southeast Asia. That's Rick, okay? There he is on the cover. After graduating from Officers Candidate School, Rick was assigned to the 7th Cavalry Regiment and became the platoon leader of the 1st Platoon Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion. As a 2nd Lieutenant Rescorla of the 7th Cavalry, he saw action in the Battle of Idrang in Vietnam in 1965, earning the nickname of Hardcore because of his bravery. 7th Cavalry. The Battle of Idrang was the first major battle between the United States Army and the North Vietnamese Army NVA part of the Pleiku campaign. If you didn't see the movie, it was one of the best movies about Vietnam and the early battles and so forth there. Mel Gibson did a great job. Sam Elliott played the part of Sergeant Major Plumley, who was another awesome man in itself. I don't think the man's scared of anything. So this is where the battle was there. It comprises 2 major engagements. The first involved the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, Custer's Regiment at the Little Bighorn Massacre, and supporting units, and took place November 14th through the 16th, 1965 at LZ X-Ray, located at the eastern foot of the Chupong, it says massive, that's a river, mountain, in the central highlands of Vietnam. In other words, when Hal Moore's group landed, or started landing, they discovered they were right at the bottom of the mountain where there's a whole big regiment of North Vietnamese camped out on the mountain. The second engagement involved the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, plus the supporting units, and took place on November 17th at LZ Albany, further north in the Idrang Valley. Now, if you saw the movie, they did not talk about Albany because it would have messed up the movie. You see down in the far left-hand bottom corner there, you see Landing Zone X-Ray. That's where the first battle was. What happened was that the part of the 7th Cav group came in to replace Hal Moore. Hal Moore's group left on helicopters. But then the powers that be, from what I understand, said, now, if we leave here on helicopters, the Vietnamese are going to use that as propaganda saying that we evacuated and escaped. So they decided to march out, okay, which was a real disaster, and we're going to go into that in just a second. On November 14th, 1965, Colonel Hal Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, air assaulted into the remote Drang Valley into landing zone X-ray, as we just talked about. Their landing stirred up a hornet's nest. Army intelligence estimated the presence of a single enemy regiment of about 2,200 soldiers in the immediate vicinity. In fact, Hal Moore's battalion, the 1st of the 7th Cavalry, had landed within strolling distance of 3 regiments of the regular army of North Vietnam. Remember, we weren't talking about the guerrillas, we're talking about the hardcore communists there. Even before Moore's battalion established a firm perimeter and landed its entire complement of 450 troops. Now, we just said they had 2,200, and we were going to land 450 troops, and one helicopter couldn't bring them in. So it took a whole lot of different helicopters. The 33rd and the 66th regiments had launched a multiple assault against the Americans. That's the North Vietnamese. Lieutenant Rick Rescorla's Bravo Company was ordered to land and support Colonel Hal Moore's men. This was after the battle had been going on for a while. When Rescorla's men landed at LZ X-ray, that's landing zone, LZ, he ordered them to set up a defensive perimeter about 50 yards behind the previous one. It was getting dark. They dug deep foxholes, set up the claymores, and carefully set up the machine guns and ammunition. They waited overnight with Rick Rescorla singing songs to keep his men steady. You know they're out there. You're in your foxhole. You know there's more of them to you. And he sang songs to kind of keep them their mind off their situation. At 0400, that's 4 o'clock in the morning, the claymores and grenades started to erupt in their front. In other words, they hit tripwires. The NVA attacked in human waves 4 times. Their first attack had more than 300 communist forces attacking, but they stopped them. Around 6:30, the North Vietnamese communists launched a large-scale attack. Rescorla and his men fought for 2.5 hours in the pre-dawn light. At daylight, Rick Rescorla took his men out of their overnight perimeter and came under massive machine gun fire from the communists. Rescorla gave the command, fix bayonets. And I can tell you, folks, that is not something you want to hear. Shooting a guy from a distance is one thing, but fixing that bayonets, that means you're going to fight eyeball to eyeball with the bad guys. By November 17th, the communist forces broke off the battle and disappeared into the mountains. The rest of the 2nd Battalion had walked in from another landing zone to support and replace Hal Moore's men. With replacements on site, more tired, battered men are helicoptered back to the base camp. And in the real life, as well as in the movie, Colonel Hal Moore made it a point that he was the last man to get on the helicopter because he's told his men he'd be with them all the way. Rather than being airlifted, the 2nd Battalion decided to march out to another landing zone, designated LZ Albany. During the march, the American units got stretched out over a wide area and came under heavy attack by the communists. What happened was they were spread out about 5 miles. They captured an NVA soldier, and the commander who was in the back of the group went to the front and called up all the lieutenants and above and the sergeants to the front with him. So without the leadership, the men were scattered out and they came under heavy fire. They said they were in elephant grass. They were basically, you were crawling and you bumped somebody, and depending on which way they grunt, you shot them or didn't shoot them. Rescorla, the only remaining officer platoon leader in Bravo Company, led the reinforcing group. The helicopter taking Rescorla into LZ Albany comes under intense fire. The pilot is hit and starts to lift the helicopter up. Rescorla and his men jumped the 10 feet to the ground under continuous heavy fire and make it to the perimeter. In other words, the helicopter was going to pull up and leave, but he jumped out so to make sure he got there. If you saw the movie made from the book, We Were Soldiers Once and Young, by Hal Moore and Joe Galloway, who lives here in North Carolina now, You saw how Colonel Hal Moore walk out to the perimeter of the battlefield and found a communist bugle. And according to the movie, that was the bugle that the French blew, or the Vietnamese blew when they were beating the French at Dien Bien Phu. Uh, and according to the movie, Hal Moore went out and picked it up and brought it back as a souvenir. But in real life, the bugle was found by Rick Rescorla and is now on display in the Infantry Museum at Fort Benning. After Rescorla and his men were such an important part of the two battles of X-Ray and Albany, where they defeated communists up to 5 to 6 times their number, the company commander of Bravo Company asked, now this is the company asking a second lieutenant if it's okay, which means he had to have a lot of respect for Rick. And they could adopt his platoon's nickname, the Hard Chargers, for the entire company. In other words, he was called the Hard Charger, and they wanted to name the entire company the Hard Chargers. That's Rick again. After his tour in Vietnam, Rick Rescorla spent a year as an instructor at Fort Benning and then got out of the regular Army and joined the Army Reserve, advancing to the rank of colonel before retiring in 1990. Rick, during that time, had earned a master's degree as well as a law degree. In 1985, Rick took a position in corporate security with Dean Whittier. Whitter. Okay. Rick Rescorla survived the 1993 car bomb attack on the World Trade Center, but later became one of the few people who realized how vulnerable the skyscraper could be to terror. You can see the World Trade Center. You can see where the basement where they tried, in the parking lot where they tried to blow it up, and they didn't do a whole lot of damage, but that's enough, as you can see there. So he became so convinced that the banking firm, at his insistence, started running drills every 3 months on how to get thousands of staff from the company's office, which covered 40 floors of the South Tower, and a site nearby out as quick as possible. As you can see there, the first tower is hit, and you can see the plane coming for the second tower. But because of their continuously doing just like fire drills, it made a big difference. On September 11th, he should not even been at work, but he was on his way to his stepdaughter's wedding in Europe, but he just stopped by the office. A picture taken after the attack started shows Rescorla, megaphone in hand, guiding staff downstairs to safety. Workers recall him singing patriotic songs that led them down. So well drilled were the staff that just 3, including Rescorla, died in the attack. He was still in the tower when it collapsed. Having gone back to look for the 2 missing and to help others, his remains have never been found. You can see the tower falling there. Rick Rescorla, head of security for banking firm Morgan Stanley Dean Whittier, is credited with the saving of 2,700 people by making sure they left the World Trade Center tower before it collapsed. 2,977 people killed when terrorists hijacked 4 passenger jets and flew them into World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and Washington. And there was another one another plane was taken over by the passengers and crashed out in the country. Pennsylvania, that's right. Okay, but there's the people trying to there. They're running as the towers again. That is a plaque there. Cyril Richard Rick Rescorla. Hell, that was where he's from. In 1939 to 2001 in New York, Rick gave his life at the terrorist attack of the World Trade Center in New York, September 11th, 2001. He went back in to get those 2 people because he felt a strong responsibility. He felt like he hadn't got his job done, and see who else he could have. And he paid a terrible price. The man was a hero in Vietnam. He could have got rested on his laurels the rest of his life, but he still wanted to serve and look after his fellow men. Okay? So what makes a person a hero? We see people every day. We don't know their stories, but they could be a hero to someone. 2 men we just met went far beyond what anyone would have expected for another person to do. They were 2 men who you could pass on the streets and never know their stories or the stories of those who touched. There were just 2 more men out there on the street. So next time that guy pulls out and cuts you off out there on the belt line, uh, you don't know what their full story. Uh, they might have a bad day also. So just think about it. John Ripley and Rick Rescorla showed us both physical courage and moral courage. It took physical courage to climb across that steel beams and through that razor wire out of that bridge. But it took moral courage to keep right on going back, keep right on going back. Courage is contagious. When a brave man takes a stand, the spines of others are often stiffened by Billy Graham, which is probably another reason that those Marines stayed there, because they had a leader with a lot of courage. As you go about your day with your life, you just may be interacting with a real hero, another John Ripley or Rick Rescorla. You don't know each person's story when you meet them. They may be a local community hero, an individual family hero, or a national hero. Heroes are just average men and women who step up when it becomes necessary for them to do what needs to be done. You yourself may be someone's hero and not even know it. Always strive to do your best. You never know when someone needs a hero and is watching you. I know most of us out there going, who in the world I'll be a hero? But you'd be surprised that people looking up and watching you and so forth. If you got children, grandchildren, that's you're their heroes. And our next guest, our next show will be John Jack Heslin. Jack has been on before. He wrote or has the Battle of Kontum website, which is one of the best websites about Vietnam and the Battle of Kontum about the same time going on as you'll ever see. I highly recommend that you go into the Battle of Kontum. Jack has written another book about his tour. He's going to be with us on his new book here, Thunder. This is stories of being a helicopter pilot on his first tour. He wrote this second because it was so personal writing this that it was very hard for him to do it. He actually has all of his records of what was going on. I don't know how he got them, but he does. And he talked with a lot of other people there with him. So he's got pretty much what you read in this book is first person true accounts with the conversations with the people that were there and so forth. So tune into the next show, which is actually August 8th of August. And be sure to tune in and see Jack. The last time we did the show, it was we did it by Skype, but he wants to come in this time personally, so he'll be sitting in the chair beside me. He's going to drive in and spend the night here, do the show, and go back. So be sure and tune in on that. Thank you for watching the show. I hope you got something out of it and were enjoyed meeting these two special men. They aren't just, we all strive to be better people, but you got to strive a whole lot to beat these two men and the things they did. It amazes me meeting these people by reading their stories and so forth. I thoroughly enjoy putting the shows together. Try to get the truth and all the stories as much as I can. Again, if you want to see the show again or some of the other shows, be sure to go to www.nissancommunications.com/live, then go to On Demand, and then go to Lessons of Vietnam. Now, very important, when you go to the Lessons of Vietnam and you select your show, click on Watch Video. If you don't, you're going to hear my wonderful voice, but you're not going to see my beautiful picture. So if you want to see the show rather than hear the show, be sure to click on Watch Video. I've had people tell me, well, I couldn't get the show. All I could get was click on Watch Video and watch the show. Watch a lot of the shows. Tell all your friends about the shows. We love to grow. We're all volunteers here. Amnon volunteers his studio and his time and his electricity. And I volunteer my time, which is not worth a whole lot, maybe, but I spend a whole lot of time on research. And again, please, I'm trying to get the real truth out there. If you're a Vietnam vet and you see something on this show that you don't think is right, please let me know, because I'd like to get it straight out and on here. Because I found that we were in Vietnam basically about 15 years, and depending on where you were, what year you were there, what your job was, branch of service, the unit you were with, all of our stories are different. The two things that all Vietnam vets so far that I have met, and I've talked to a lot of them, the two things we all have in common is when that plane door opened or that ship opened up, is the smells and the heat and humidity of Vietnam. Most of us had never experienced anything like that before or since. But after that, as we got dispersed across the country, because Vietnam was not a big country, but it was a long country. It had mountains, it had swamps, it had rivers, it had flat land, it had the Montagnards, it had the Hmong people, all different kinds of ethnicity there. So a lot of stories out there that we'll be trying to bring. I want to bring you a story about the Montagnards, which were the mountain people, and I want to bring you a story about the Hmong, which was the people of Laos, who basically we walked off and left just like we did the Montagnards. There was a war going on in Vietnam, but most of us don't know there was also a war going on in Laos that was just as deadly, just as hard. But if you look at the map, Laos is where most of the Ho Chi Minh Trail was. What Ho Chi Minh Trail was the area that was bringing down all the military supplies from North Vietnam down into South Vietnam to supply the guerrillas as well as the NVA down in the South. So Laos was, even though it was supposed to be a neutral country, there was a war going on there, and it's quite a story into itself. So thank you again for tuning in, and be sure to get that movie, The Thunder with Ripley. I think you will thoroughly enjoy it. It's not that expensive. I've been trying to wait for it to come to the theater, but I got tired of waiting, so I went out and bought it. Y'all have a good evening, and wherever you are, I hope you're dry. We've been getting a little bit of rain here, which we badly needed, but we don't need the floods. So, and good night to all of y'all, and we will see you August 8th with our friend Jack Heslin. Thank you.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Telestream's Wirecast software, StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.